So we all know that Brexit is basically one giant, continuing, lurching train wreck of a mess that has been really forced on a lot of people because, as we've said before, look, a lot of these people out there really didn't vote for Brexit because they thought, they could get one up over on the government. That's the truth. And then a lot of other people generally didn't think that Europe was that important to us because, as we've covered before, there's been a 40-year campaign and no Prime Minister really, for years, has been honest about the benefits we've had from Europe. And only now is this stuff actually being talked about, which is good, because now you are seeing in all these polls why Remain is now slowly creeping ahead. And, you've only got to go back to the referendum campaign of where Leave was selling pretty much every single version of Brexit possible. Oh yes, we'll be staying, we'll be leaving Europe, but we'll be staying in the single market. Only a fool would leave a single market. Remember that phrase forever whenever this comes up, because this comes from Martin Kettle, and I agree with this point of view, that any hope for any compromise is now gone. And this isn't a Remainers' fault. This is a Brexiteers' fault. They're the ones that are so adamant and fighting and not willing to come to any sort of compromise. But there you go. So, ever since the Brexit vote in June 2016, many of us pro-Europeans have had to live with a dilemma. On one hand, we regard the vote to leave the European Union as a disaster for our country. On the other, we accept that the galling reality is that it was a democratically expressed view of the majority. 3 years on, I still think we were right about Brexit, but we still lost the vote. The inescapable tension between these two conclusions has never gone away, but it has certainly evolved. The passage of time and Theresa May's rigid and error-strewn handling of the Brexit process have reset the options more than once. Until recently, my view could have been summarised as follows. Brexit remains a limitable event and I will always oppose it, but in the absence of public permission to overturn it, a softer version would be less bad than a hard one, and could provide the fragile basis for an eventual form of reintegration with Europe down the line. At times in the past 5 months, ever since the UK and the EU struck the withdrawal agreement, a pragmatic compromise of this kind has seemed tantalisingly viable. Despite though how hard they try, throughout the winter, the hard Brexiteers failed to harden the original deal or take May down in the way they wanted. They left space in the political centre. So, when May finally made an opening to Labour in early April, there was a possibility that a Brexit compromise was on the cards. Even at the 11th hour, in spite of the immense party political difficulties it might entail for both. But it hasn't happened. Talks between the government and Labour continue, but they are not going anywhere. And they aren't going anywhere. Big shocker. This week, both May and Corbyn accused the other of dragging their feet. That could be a cunning joint deception, preparing their respective parties for a surprise deal. But if it isn't the case, believe me, there is an increasing air of unreliability about the whole thing. On both sides of the table, the participants are looking over their shoulders, not at their colleagues, not negotiating in earnest. There are 3 big issues on the table in these talks, but there is no agreement on any of them. The first is to overturn the terms of a future customs union and on the single market alignment. The second, on which 2 sides have the biggest arguments, is on future-proofing any agreement against the next Conservative leader. The third is over the role, if any, of a confirmatory vote on each of these. May is unwilling to make concessions or even put the options on the table. That would be a further deepen the divide the Tories, while Corbyn remains deeply reluctant to become a co-owner and a joint agreement that might end in the overturning of Brexit. It is now increasingly obvious that the two parties are going through the motions, and the talks are doomed. Labour has more time on its side than the Tories because Corbyn is happy to see the Tories humiliated in the EU elections at the end of May. Neither of them wants to be blamed for failed talks, nor is either of them wanting them to strong or determined enough to suggest the kind of grand bargaining, the parliamentary support for a soft Brexit in return for a confirmatory referendum, for instance, which the circumstances cry out for. This means two things. Both must now be faced. The first is that, as things stand, Parliament's efforts to take control of Brexit from the government have failed. In March, this sovereign Parliament route seemed to offer a way forward. May's deal was dead. Backbenchers came up with cross-party ideas. The Speaker facilitated the process. Marches and petitions gave the feeling of momentum. When it came to the crunch, however, MPs knew what they didn't want: no deal. But what they didn't want was that Parliament turns out to be no more able to pass a soft Brexit than pass a harder one like May's. The soft conclusion, therefore, is that a soft Brexit itself has also failed, and soft Brexit was the least worst option of Brexit. To succeed, however, May needs to reach out much earlier, probably back in 2016, and certainly after the 2017 election. It never happened. Now, last-minute backbench attempts to crack a soft Brexit, led by Nick Boyles and Stephen Kinnock, have failed. Cabinet efforts have failed too. Finally, the inner-party attempt to plough through into the sand as well. So a soft Brexit must now be added to a no-deal Brexit, and May's Brexit deal on the political scrap heap of the past 3 years. What then happened, the dilemma facing us pro-Europeans, has changed too. With no viable soft Brexit option on offer any longer, it has become meaningless to stand for a compromise that reset on the possibilities that MPs and parties would strike a deal. The attempt to reconcile Britain's place in Europe with the Leave victory of 2016, while the Brexit process is therefore dead. It was killed by the hardline Brexiteers and by May's rigidity. We pragmatic pro-Europeans are therefore discharged from our dilemma. The times have changed. Labour is now crucial to the outcome of the new Brexit crisis, even if it doesn't want to be. The outcome of the increasingly likely general election, and thus the outcome of Brexit, will depend on Labour's election manifesto and its pledges on Brexit. Not just on whether it promises a referendum at all, but on whether the vote would precede a fresh EU negotiations or come afterwards. The internal argument is already underway, and it is massively important. The larger Brexit choices of 2019 are starker too. With a centre option on Brexit collapsing, the decision lies between extremes. We are back to remain or leave, but now in 2019, the versions of these, the times will inevitably be very divided again. The effective Brexit choice will lie between no deal, promoted by May's successor and much of the Tory party, and the second vote, hopefully, but by no means certainly promoted by Corbyn and by other pro-parties too. But the choice for pro-Europeans now has been clarified, and no pro-European cannot doubt where they must now stand. And that, I think, is completely agreeable. You have a parliament, a sovereign parliament, despite, the cries of the Brexiteers that, Parliament has not been sovereign, apparently all these years. But here we have a sovereign parliament who's gone, our leader, the person who's meant to be leading, has failed, so we are now going to take charge. And unfortunately, they weren't able to come to a cross-party agreement either. So we are now left with a situation where compromise has become impossible, and we are now left with two extremes. We either go with a no deal, which would be absolutely disastrous for this country, or we just remain. Which basically means that things stay as they are. And things now as they are pretty good. necessarily not politically in this country, because we have a lot of problems in this country, and the vast majority of them, in fact all of them, are not, you know, put on us by the EU. They have been put on us by a government that has imposed austerity on us and has shown numerous times throughout certainly the past 2 years that austerity was always a choice. You look at the other countries that have gone out of austerity. They've always done a program of, we're going to go austerity, but all this money that we save, we're going to pile back into programs that help, you know, that reinvest in the country. The Conservative idea for austerity has just been, we're just going to cut money, and we're just going to cut even more money, and we're just going to cut, and that somehow it'll be magnificent. But it's not. And that's where we've ended up.